Great Fire of London. Full story. Now.
September 1st, 1666. A baker forgets to fully extinguish his oven before bed. Within 72 hours, the greatest city in Europe is reduced to ash. This matters because what happened in London could happen to any major city today. The same mistakes, the same denial, the same catastrophic failure. By the end, you'll see exactly how one man's carelessness destroyed 13,200 buildings, made 80,000 people homeless, and changed urban planning forever. If you're into history that feels uncomfortably modern, subscribe. Let's jump in. Basically, the Great Fire of London was a 4-day inferno that consumed 4/5 of the medieval city in September 1666. Today we'll cover 3 things. First, what made London a tinderbox waiting to explode. Second, the 72 hours of chaos when the city burned. And third, how this disaster accidentally created the modern city. But the most surprising part? The official death toll was only 6 people. And that's a complete lie. To understand how London burned, you need to see what London was. Picture 400,000 people crammed into 1 square mile. Buildings made entirely of timber, jutting out story by story, until neighbors could shake hands across the street from their top windows. No building codes, no fire regulations, just wood stacked on top of wood. Walk down any street and your senses would be assaulted. The smell of fresh bread mixed with rotting fish from the Thames and coal smoke from thousands of chimneys. The sound of blacksmiths hammering, church bells ringing every hour, vendors screaming about their wares until their voices went hoarse. The city rose vertically because it couldn't spread outward. St. Paul's Cathedral dominated the skyline with its 489-foot Gothic spire. The Royal Exchange buzzed with merchants trading fortunes. Goldsmiths on Lombard Street held the treasures of nobility. London controlled trade routes from the Caribbean to the Far East. The wealth was staggering. But here's what most people miss. That same density that created wealth also created the perfect conditions for disaster. Wooden buildings packed tight, narrow streets that blocked fire access. And the summer of 1666 had been brutal. 8 months without significant rain. Every building was dried kindling. As a quick aside, London had burned before in 1212, killing 3,000 people. They knew the risk. They just chose to ignore it. 1 in the morning, September the 2nd, 1666, Pudding Lane, near London Bridge. Thomas Fariner was the king's baker. Successful, respected. That night he did what he'd done thousands of times, banked his ovens, leaving coals smouldering to save time in the morning. Sometime around 1 a.m. those coals found fuel, maybe spilled flour, maybe a dried timber beam. The exact mechanism doesn't matter. Within minutes, Fariner's shop was ablaze. He and his family escaped by climbing through an upstairs window and crawling across rooftops. His maid refused, too terrified of heights. She became the fire's first victim, though no one would know for days. Now pause, notice this detail. There was wind that night, an eastern gale that would blow steadily for 3 entire days, driving flames westward through the city like a living thing with purpose. By dawn, 300 houses were burning. Lord Mayor Thomas Bloodworth was dragged from bed and brought to Pudding Lane. He looked at the flames consuming block after block and said words that would haunt him forever. Piss on it, a woman might piss it out. Then he went back to bed. This wasn't just arrogance. Here's why it matters. Creating fire breaks by demolishing houses required the Lord Mayor's direct authorization. But those houses belonged to wealthy men who could sue for damages. Bloodworth chose legal safety over the city's survival. By the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. Sunday became a day of mounting horror. The fire reached the Thames warehouses stocked with oil, tallow, brandy, and pitch. When these ignited, flames leaped 100 feet into the air. Witnesses said the heat was unbearable from a quarter-mile away. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, watched pigeons hover above their burning nests, unwilling to leave until their wings caught fire and they fell like stones into the inferno. Most people get this part wrong. They think people just evacuated calmly. No. Panic erupted immediately. People frantically loaded possessions onto boats in the Thames, only to watch the boats themselves catch fire from floating embers. Which one would you save, your family or your life savings? Comment below. By Monday, September 3rd, the fire was a mile wide. St. Paul's Cathedral, that ancient symbol of London's permanence, was engulfed. Its lead roof melted and poured through the streets in literal rivers of molten metal. The heat was so intense that the cathedral's stones exploded, sending shrapnel like artillery fire. King Charles II himself took to the streets, passing buckets of water and offering gold guineas to firefighters. It made no difference. The fire had become a force of nature beyond human control. Quick recap. So far, we've seen a city built to burn, a spark that found perfect conditions, and leaders who hesitated when they should have acted. Now comes the darkest chapter. The roads out of London became choked with refugees. The wealthy hired every cart and boat, offering obscene prices. The poor walked, carrying children and elderly parents on their backs. Some didn't make it. In 2 minutes, I'll show you the most disturbing part of this story. Here's where it gets psychological. Londoners, still traumatized by the plague that had killed 100,000 people just 1 year before, needed someone to blame. A French watchmaker was nearly lynched by a mob convinced he'd started the fire as sabotage. Dutch and French residents were beaten in the streets. England was at war with both France and Holland. The paranoia fed on itself. Families had to make impossible choices. The elderly and infirm couldn't move quickly. Some were left behind in burning houses by families who chose between saving the living and dying with the dead. The fire consumed more than buildings. The Guildhall, centre of government, burned. The Royal Exchange, heart of commerce, became rubble. 87 parish churches were destroyed. If you'd stood outside London on Tuesday, September 4th, you would have seen a wall of flame stretching for miles, towering hundreds of feet up, generating winds so powerful they created fire tornadoes that hurled burning debris across the Thames. By Thursday, September 6th, the fire burned itself out. 4 days, 4/5 of the city gone. Here's the key fact. 13,200 houses destroyed, 87 churches reduced to shells, between 65,000 and 80,000 people homeless, and the official death toll? 6 people. Let me show you why that matters. The fire burned so hot it completely cremated bodies, leaving no trace. The poor, the elderly, the sick, who couldn't escape, simply disappeared from history. Modern historians estimate hundreds, possibly thousands died. We'll never know the true number. The economic impact was catastrophic. £10 million in property damage when the entire annual revenue of the English government was only £2 million. Entire industries wiped out. Lifetimes of work turned to ash in hours. But here's what changed everything. From those ashes, something unexpected grew. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 mandated brick and stone construction. Streets were widened. Christopher Wren designed a new St. Paul's Cathedral that became one of the world's architectural masterpieces. As a quick aside, the fire also accidentally ended the Great Plague. The intense heat killed the rats and fleas carrying the disease. Londoners who survived both catastrophes saw it as divine providence. Insurance companies were founded, creating an entirely new industry. Fire brigades were professionalized. The very concept of urban planning, the idea that cities should be designed with safety in mind, was born from the ashes of 1666. Here's the key takeaway. The Great Fire wasn't just a 17th century disaster. It's a blueprint for what happens when cities ignore warnings. Remember the opening line about one baker's mistake destroying Europe's greatest city? Here's the real answer. It wasn't one mistake. It was hundreds of small decisions, building with wood to save money, packing buildings tight to maximize space, ignoring fire risks because addressing them was inconvenient. What we can say for sure is that London burned because humans chose short-term profit over long-term safety. What we can't fully prove is the exact death toll, but we know it was far higher than 6. This changes how we think about urban disasters because we're still making the same mistakes today. California burns from the same combination: drought, wind, and infrastructure built without thinking about fire. We see the same official hesitation, the same denial. But it also raises one question: if we know the pattern, why do we keep repeating it? If you want the answer to that, I'm covering the Chicago fire of 1871 next. Same mistakes, bigger city, different century. Subscribe if you're into history that refuses to stay in the past. And comment, would you rebuild in the same spot or abandon the city entirely? Anyways, I'm watching the past bleed into the present. And together we remember when time bled. I'll see you in the next era.